Hey everyone, this is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and today I'm going to be doing my concept of the week on planning. Before we start, in case you've never used a video like this before, if you're watching this on my site, you'll see a bunch of titles over on the left. You may click on any of these to skip to that particular part of the video at any time. I'd suggest the first time you watch this video that you watch it straight through, just to ensure minimal knowledge gaps, but just thought I'd throw that out there for those of you that have never seen a video like this before. So with that said, let's get started. So, poker probably seems like an incredibly complicated game. The decision matrix of possible happenings can get vastly large, especially when we start considering different variables. The goal of this video is to learn how to simplify information in a way that allows us to simplify our decision making in real time. With simplified information, it can make the planning process much smoother and allow us to think moves ahead. My goal while playing is to think about the flop while I'm pre-flop, and to have a plan for the river while I'm playing the flop. This might not seem easy at first, but learning it is the building block of interpreting information of any sort and finding optimal ways to put that information to use. There is so much information in poker, everything from our hand to the turn card, to the suit of the second card on the flop, to the timing of our opponent's actions. And when we start to consider the information that we are giving away at the same time, the number of inputs can be staggering. But there's good news. We can begin to simplify this process by compartmentalizing certain things. Simply put, we're trying to condense all the information into easier to process chunks. So instead of thinking of different flops like Ace-8-5 or 9-9-6, we can simplify them into simpler chunks, which later become factors in our decision matrix. We can do the same thing with player types, turn cards, river cards, and even things like bet sizing. Let's look at some of the basic things we can compartmentalize. We can compartmentalize player types for sure, rather than looking at a VPIP and PFR, and whatever other stats we may or may not have. We should look to compartmentalize player types in the beginning. I use 6 different player types: nits, tags, lags, aggro-fish, passive fish, and unknowns. I actually simplify this down to 5 types because I treat any unknown like a passive fish, as I play the most straightforward against a passive fish and respect their raises the most. While it may seem too optimistic to simplify player types down to only 5 categories, I adjust as I get more information and only use my default lines per player type if I don't have information to lead me to another decision. Next, I compartmentalize flop textures. Rather than looking at each flop differently, which would make for a little under 20,000 different flops, taking out R2 cards, we should look to simplify them. I break flops into about 7 different types, with 0 Broadway cards, singles, doubles, triples, monotones, paired, and bingo flops. While we could actually break flops down into just wet and dry, I like to not oversimplify one of the most important components in our decision-making process post-flop. While there are differences between an Ace-8-7 and a King-9-5 board, they do play relatively similarly in general, and thus why I put them together in the same single Broadway category. We can also do the same thing with turn and river textures. Same as we did in the flop, we can look at them in the same simplifying manner. Here are the basic ways I break down turn and river cards: overcards, bricks, board pairs, draw fillers, and through cards. While these can certainly overlap, an overcard that fills a draw, or a through card that's also a brick, it can help us in our planning process. We'll talk more about this later in the video. The next one is probably the more important one, and this is our hand strength. Many players only think about the absolute strength of their hand, which is less than ideal to say the least. Because hand strengths are so relative, we can put them into one of 4 categories: bluffs, semi-bluffs, value hands, and showdown value hands. When we are able to appropriately classify our hand strength, we are able to actualize the real value of our hands and take lines accordingly. The next one we can use is types of mistakes. Many times players forget to think about the types of mistakes our opponents are likely to make. I break them down into 2 very simple categories: players who make a lot of betting mistakes and players who make a lot of calling mistakes. Now this is obviously extremely simple. While it's obvious that most aggro fish are going to make more betting mistakes and most passive fish are going to make more calling mistakes, it's important that we think about it against nits, tags, and lags as well. If we can figure out what kind of mistakes our opponent is more prone to make, it can make playing all of our hand strength simpler. If they make too many calling mistakes, then we obviously wouldn't bluff them. If they make a lot of betting mistakes, then we can consider checking and inducing with showdown value or even with value hands. This is a very important thing to notate, especially as we begin to learn if that player understands showdown value and or polarization. The last one I'm going to talk about in this video is bet sizing. We see bet sizes all of the time, but rarely do we stop to think about them in a way that we should. I break bet sizes down like this: normal sizes, smaller ones, bigger ones, and massive ones. Most of the time in full ring we play straightforward and avoid giving action to massive sizes without the nuts, and give action much more liberally to smaller sized bets. While this is probably obvious, it can help when we are choosing our line on future streets, especially if we're planning on going for a check field type line against a player who makes face up bet sizes. Let's move on to decision matrices and trees. In the planning process, we can usually figure out the EV of a line by thinking about payoffs and frequencies. We can use matrices and trees to visualize how profitable lines are, and consider different lines as well. Here's a basic example of a matrix. Say we're on the flop. We can either bet or we can check. If we bet, they will either fold or continue. If we check, they will either bet or check behind. This is a simple matrix where we can put the frequencies and expected payoffs of the plays in. From there, we can simply take the most profitable line, assuming that of course that our parameters are correct. We can also use decision trees to visualize lines as well. So let's take a situation where we have fours right here. So if we're doing a decision tree, we take our point here where we're at, and we have three different options. We can fold, we can call, or we can raise. So when we're thinking about what we want to do, we kind of want to just quickly visualize what each of those branches is good for. So if we fold, it's obviously going to be neutral EV. If we call, we're probably going to get ISO'd a decent amount of the time, especially in the aggro games nowadays. If we raise, is that really going to be good? Are we going to be able to steal the blinds? Are we going to get 3-bet a lot? Are we going to get flatted a lot? Do we want that? Do we not? Blah, blah, blah. So if we're at a table here where we see a bunch of aggressive 3-betters behind us, is raising really going to be that great of an idea? Maybe, maybe not, probably not though. So trees and matrices are two ways of visualizing the same thing. And we're going to look at a decent amount of decision trees in this video, and it's something that we should be considering whenever we're playing and thinking about different lines we could take. We could even use decision trees to visualize the profitability of, say, a continuation bet. So take this hand where we have 8-6 suited, folds around to us, we steal, button calls, and we see a heads up flop. And we're saying that we think his pre-flop range is probably deuces the jacks and ace king and ace queen. We don't think he's very 3-betting, so we don't think he'll 3-bet that kind of stuff. And we expect that he's going to play relatively straightforward. Fold his air, call his showdown value hands, and raise his nuts. So kind of straightforward tag, nothing special about that. So on the flop comes ace-jack 4, and obviously at this point all we have is a bluff. So this hits his ace-king, ace-queen, pocket jacks, and pocket 4 as part of his range, and obviously misses everything else. So he misses the flop about 62% of the time, hits a set about 10%, and has top pair the other 28. So if we did a quick decision tree, we see that if we bet, we're winning that about 62% of the time, and if we bet, getting called 28 and getting raised about 10. So if we made a normal half pot c-bet, we're expecting to make a decent amount of money, assuming again that the parameters we built are correct, that his range is what it is, and that he's going to play straightforward with it. So this kind of decision tree is very, very simple, especially when we have bluff hands, because when we have bluff hands, all we really care about is, do we get enough folds? If they give up and fold enough of the time, then we take it. If they don't, then maybe we don't take it. And it gets a little complex when we take situations where people start shifting certain parts of their range into other parts. So say they take air and start turning it into a bluff, that kind of stuff, or start taking the nuts and start flat calling it occasionally. That's when we can start running into some trouble, and we're looking at a situation like that right now. So we're taking a situation where we raise kings, end up getting one caller, and go heads up to it. And let's say that we just think he has a normal set mining range of something like deuces to queens, but he will bluff occasionally post-flop. So if the flop comes out 9-7-4, and he checks us. So at this point, we see, if we visualize his range, that he has a set about 15% of the time, over pairs, 10s through queens about 32%, and the rest is smaller unsetted pairs. So if we're considering a c-bet tree, and assuming that he understands showdown value, so he's never going to turn 10s through queens into a bluff, we see that he's going to call our c-bet 32% of the time, 15% of the time, that he has that set, he's either going to raise us or occasionally call us. Obviously, he's never going to fold. And 53% of the time, when he has the crap part of his range, he's going to fold it sometimes, float it sometimes, or raise it sometimes. So the confusing part when he raises is figuring out how often it's the nutted part of his range and how often it's him turning something like pocket threes into a bluff. While this spot isn't as clear cut as the villain who played everything straightforward, we still have to make the best assumptions possible. If we think that he rarely bluffs and raises, why would we call it? If we know that he wouldn't turn tens through queens into a bluff by raising it, so his range would be incredibly polarized if he check raised here. Now, if his range was too bottom side weighted, we can call and induce. If his range is too top side weighted, we can fold and get away cheap. Again, take notes so we can use the reads that we have on players and use more correct and full information when we're making our lines, rather than just having to kind of guess and use more default lines. And you don't want to use default lines as much in the big pots. You'd much rather use reads at all times, just because it makes your information more real and correct. Alright, so let's talk about planning from preflop. When we're preflop, we want to think about what could logically happen if we take certain lines. It's actually this exact process that created the standard hand ranges that most players use, and should be used to create your future hand ranges as well. When we're considering preflop actions, we want to think about a few things. First, what would happen if we logically raise this? Would we get 3-bet a lot? Will we get a lot of callers? And are these things that we really want? Always ask yourself before you do anything what you expect it to accomplish and what you want to have happen. 2. What would logically happen if we called this raise? Will we get squeezed often? If so, do we have a plan for that? Are we calling strictly to set mine, or are we bluffing sometimes? Is this someone we can even bluff? Will our call encourage a multi-way pot? Again, thinking about what could logically happen. 3. What is our relative position? If we raise from early position with a massive fish and MP, do we expect that pot to go heads up or multi-way? Is that good or bad? If we steal with something from late position, will another player increase their 3-bet range because of that position? Again, is this good or is this bad? Do we have a plan on what we're going to do if we do get 3-bet? 4. If we're going to see a flop a large percentage of the time, can we win with a c-bet easily? If not, does this hand do well post-flop? That kind of stuff. 5. If we're going to 3-bet, what do we logically expect to happen? Is this an action that we like or dislike? Is it important that we 3-bet here, or do we not really have to have a 3-bet range? Of course there are other things to consider, but these should get you headed in the right direction. Just because it's a standard play to raise ace-queen for middle position doesn't mean it would be good at this table, especially with aggressive 3-betters behind us. Isolating king-queen is standard, but might be bad in certain situations. 9-4 off is a standard fold from the cutoff, but we might 3-bet if the spot were good. Make sure we consider our actions and take lines that exploit the information that we have. If we have very little information, then take basic default lines that are safe and intelligent. Now let's talk about planning from post-flop. When we're post-flop, we have lots of important planning to think about. Because decisions made post-flop are almost always more costly, it's necessary that our plans and lines are even more solid. Here are some things that I usually consider when thinking about my post-flop plan. First, what is my hand strength? This is basic, yet very important. Being able to appropriately classify my hand strength will allow me to choose lines easier. Being able to know whether my hand is showdown value as opposed to value will help create a plan. Second, what would a bet accomplish? This may seem basic, but we always need to ask ourselves this. If we fire a bet here, do we expect results that are favorable for us? Oftentimes, just asking this question alone will help us classify our hand strength, in the event that we haven't answered that question already. If we have ace-jack on an ace-10, 7-4 board, and don't think that second best hands would continue if we bet, then we know that we have showdown value, or a bluff, rather than a value hand. Third, how does my opponent make mistakes? Does he make a lot of betting mistakes or calling mistakes? Of course we can expect a passive fish to make a lot of calling mistakes and a lag or an aggro fish to generally make more betting mistakes, so we should consider taking lines that allow our opponents to make the most amount of mistakes possible. 4. What pot size am I getting involved in? More importantly, if I get involved in the pot size that I think I'm heading towards, am I happy with that? If I have top pair top kicker and my stack is getting threatened, do I think that that kind of hand would win in a pot size against this opponent? Many times in full ring, top pair top kicker isn't worth a 200 big blind pot. So if I'm playing against a player who would only get involved in a 200 big blind pot with the nuts, why the hell am I still involved in it with top pair, or even two pair? This is why hand strengths are so relative, and pot sizes our opponents are trying to create can help us more accurately classify our own hand strength. And 5 is, what bet sizing am I going to use? If I'm going to bet, do I think this bet size I have chosen is appropriate? Is my opponent elastic or inelastic? If I make this bet size, what does it accomplish? Is that good or bad? Bet sizing is such an art form, but if we just think about what it does for pot geometry and the contortion of their range, it becomes much easier. Here's an example of a hand so I can show you what I'm talking about. Say MP opens and I end up calling from the blinds with 10s. So we see a heads up flop of Jack 7-4, and I think about my two decisions. I can donk or I can check. Well, a donk looks odd, doesn't really do much for me, as not much worse calls, not much better folds, and I probably make more from his c-bet range as a whole, which should relatively be wide. A check, I should expect him to c-bet this board most of the time. A donk lets him play closer to perfect, which I don't want, and I don't really want to donk and face a raise, so I just decided to go for a check here, pretty standard, and he c-bets for half pot. So if we think about our three options, which are raise, call, or fold, we can just break them down and think about what each one does. So a raise, my hand has showdown value. A raise doesn't really accomplish anything, so all it does is kind of turn my hand into a bluff, so I'm not going to raise. That's not really that great. A call is possible. If I don't think that I'm getting double-barreled here by a very balanced range, then calling here is fine. It allows me to maintain a pot size creation goal that I'm very, very comfortable with. It maintains my showdown value. It retains the mistake-rich environment. Plus, I already have a plan that I'm probably going to check the turn and fold a few barrels, thinking that he wouldn't do that without a big hand. And I also know how I'm going to win the pot. This is a really, really important piece of the puzzle. We want to know how we're going to win pots, or at least have an idea on how we're going to get to showdown, and if we can do so easily and cheaply with showdown value hands. And if not, if we can't get to showdown, or if we think we're going to have to get involved in a really expensive pot in order to do that, then generally getting out early is going to be better than getting out later. And of course the third option is to fold, which is also possible. If I thought that I was getting double barreled here a ton by a relatively balanced range, then folding now would generally be better than going into a check call, check feel situation. As that creates a bigger pot size that I don't really want to get involved in with a second pair hands. So again, I have an entire plan laid out simply by looking at all of my options and thinking about some basic future options and creating a line from there. And you notice in doing this, I looked at my hand strength, I looked at my opponent, what I think he's logically going to do, how many turn cards there are that are bad or good for us. I'm just kind of keeping that in the back of my head, and all the while thinking about the pot size creation goals and whether or not, what kind of pot size I think I'm going to be getting involved in, and whether or not that's good or bad for me. So, not very complicated, but something that you should definitely be doing when you're considering your lines, and especially when you start playing against more aggression. You need to be thinking about these things much earlier rather than getting yourself into a massive pot and then having to make a decision that can be relatively costly either way you take it on your win rate, which obviously we don't want to be doing all that much. We can also use these thoughts when we're thinking about it on the other side of the coin, when we have the lead in the hand. So say we take a hand where we steal king 9, get called by the small blind, go heads up to a king high flop, and he checks us. So of course at this point we have our two options. We could continuation bet or we could check. So if we look at continuation betting first, if I thought that he was going to float this flop a lot, then obviously continuation betting is awesome. If we think he's going to check raise us a lot and we don't really know how to handle it, we don't know if he's balanced, we don't know if he's going to be one and done, we don't know if he's going to dub us a lot, blah blah blah, then checking behind has some validity as well. But if we think that he'd make a lot more calling mistakes if we bet now, then betting now with intentions of aiming for a 2-street play, totally fine. So the lines we would take for that are something like a bet check, a bet check bet, a bet check call, something like that. And those are perfectly good lines as default lines. Also, if I were to c-bet, I have to think about the size I would use. So if I were going to c-bet and try to get calls from second best hands, what size gets me the most amount of value and keeps his range with the most second best hands? That generally half pot will do the job. And think about that. Always be thinking about bet sizing. And the same thing if we had a bluff hand. If we had Jack 10 suited here and we wanted to fold, would a pot size bet get the job done? If so, could I go smaller? Would he fold to something like half pot? If he would, then why not do that? It's always thinking about that parlay of giving yourself the best price and giving yourself a buffer between how often it has to work and how often it does work. So that's kind of the things that we're thinking about if we're going to go for a c-bet. And then the other side of the coin is obviously we could consider checking here. And checking is fine if we think that he would read it as weakness and either bluff the turn more or call the turn more comfortably. So say he had something like pocket sevens, if we thought that he would check fold sevens on the flop, but maybe check call sevens more liberally on the turn, it gives checking a little bit more validity. Of course, in doing this, we do take the parlay of allowing him to make mistakes at the same time that we're allowing him to improve for cheap. But everything in poker has risks, so that's not really all that shocking. So if we did decide to take this check line, we're pretty much going for something like a check bet feel, or a check call call, or a check call feel, and pretty much have our entire line planned out. We're already thinking about where we are in the river as opposed to just thinking about where we are now. We already have a concept on how we're going to get to showdown, what the pot size would be, and how many streets of value we really want to throw in the middle, all the while considering how he's going to make the most amount of mistakes and taking a line that exploits that. Also, as we get more information on players, we can take more correct lines. If we were playing against an opponent who views checking the King 8-5 board as turning our hand face up, then we might not do it. If we knew the player would call for 3 streets with something like 9-8, then we might bet all the way down. With information, our lines will be stronger, but will also be very opponent specific as opposed to the default lines, which we talked about earlier. So the last thing I wanted to do in this video is do a full hand example in depth so you can sort of see how my brain thinks about these kinds of spots. So I figured we'd do one with everyone's oh-so-favorite hand, Ace-King. So we're pre-flop, we're under the gun +1, folds to us, and it's our action. So of course we have our 3 options. We could limp it, we could raise it, or we could fold it. So let's kind of sit here and think for a minute and see what we want to do. And we're kind of just break it down very, very simply. So of course we want to look around first, kind of see what's going on. So say we're at a table like this, or we have a bunch of really aggressive 3-betters behind us. Is raising here really going to be all that good? We're probably going to get a 3-bet a lot, and do we really want to get involved in a let's create the 4-bet dynamic from EP game? Probably not. So in a table like this, especially where we know there's a lot of aggressive 3-betters, especially in position, there's not a lot of motivation for getting involved. So we can't really raise it. Obviously limping is complete crap, so folding would generally be the best option because we can't really get involved any other way. Or what about at this table, where we look around and we see there's a bunch of stations around the table? Is this really going to be something that we want to get involved in, especially when a lot of them are on the between us and the button? Is this really going to be that good? We're probably relatively likely to go multi-way, and we're generally going to be out of position, and of course we're going to have Ace-King, which is going to be pretty much a very, very difficult spot to play. Even if we catch top pair, it's still going to be relatively hard. And again, what's my motivation? If I raise here and we go multi-way, I'm going to brick the flop a ton, and how am I really going to show profit in this spot? So rather than mindlessly open a hand just because it's on our hand chart, or people say we can't fold Ace-King pre or whatever, always think about the situation that you're in. Every situation is specific to you and what you're doing and what's going on at your table, and don't force things that don't have to be forced. Always think about what's good. So a limp preflop wasn't good, a raised preflop's probably going to do exactly this, and it's going to happen a ton. And again, folding is neutral EV, it's safe, it keeps you out of trouble, and nobody said that folding Ace-King preflop is going to be a crime. Alright, and one quick note is just because we opened it and we get 3-bet doesn't necessarily mean that raising was bad. And just because we raise it and it goes multi-way doesn't necessarily mean that opening it was bad. It's when we're at a table and we expect it to go multi-way a ton of the time and we're going to be out of position that it gets kind of ugly. It's when we expect that it's going to get 3-bet 30-40% of the time that it gets really ugly. it's the definition of insanity is doing the same thing twice and expecting different results. And if you're at a table where you know you're getting 3-bet a ton, you don't act surprised when it happens, because it's going to. If you see a bunch of mega fish behind you, don't act surprised when it goes multi-way. Don't force situations that you don't have to. If you have, bad relative position or whatever, either get off the table, play musical chairs, whatever you have to do. Don't put yourself in a spot where you're just raise folding every single time, or raise and you never put yourself in a good spot post flop. Always be thinking ahead what could logically happen, and think about whether or not you want these things to actually happen a lot of the time. Alright, so let's just break it down. Say we're at a normal table, and pretty much standard is to open this for 3x and play some poker from here. So I do just that, and at this point I pretty much have a full plan for most logical happenings that could happen. So if I get 3-bet, I'm probably going to fold, especially if it's anybody 3-betting me but a tag or a lag. If I go multi-way, I'm probably not going to bluff c-bet, especially from out of position. If I go heads up, I'm not going to bluff c-bet bad spots, especially from out of position, most of the time. If I'm heads up and I am in position, I'm probably going to check some top pairs behind if the spot calls for it, and if it's a good spot for it, if I think it's inducing a lot. If I go heads up in position, I might bluff c-bet some good boards. If I go heads up and flop massive, I'm probably trying to get a huge pot going. If I go heads up and flop non-massive, I'm probably going to try to create a small to mid-sized pot as a standard. So pretty much any logical happening that could happen has been considered, and you notice most of those plans have to do with the flop. Thinking about c-bet game, thinking about whether or not I want to check behind some top pair type hands, etc. And a couple of them are thinking about rivers, just general pot size creation goals. If I get a big hand, I want to create a big pot type thing. And very, very simple. I mean, and these are things that you do off the table. So you kind of, whenever you go into a game, you're already prepared. You already know, okay, this is my general plan with this kind of hand, and this is how it would change, this is when it wouldn't change, blah, blah, blah. Very, very simple, but important that we start thinking like this, and it's almost training your brain to think systematically, but very, very important. This planning stuff will be a very, very important part of your poker growth if and when you start using it. So there we go, pretty much have an idea for any logical happening. It's not exactly perfect, but if something changes, at least it gets us in the right ballpark of where we want to be going. So we end up raising, end up getting one caller from the button, who is a 13-10 tag, and we see a heads up flop of Jack 9-5 with a flush draw. So now we'll look at our two options, which of course are check or c-bet. Again, not that complex. So checking would be a good option if we think that he would never fold enough of the time to a c-bet. Then obviously we would just check fold, and that would be totally fine. Part of being a good poker player and being aggressive is knowing when to cut your loss, knowing when a bet just is going to be useless and it's either too thin or maybe not even showing any sort of profit. If that be the case, there's nothing wrong with just check folding here, especially if he has, low fold versus c-bet type thing, or he likes to attack versus you, that kind of stuff. Against a fish or anything like that, obviously just check folding here is totally fine if you don't think he's folding enough. If you think he's fit or fold, then we can consider that c-bet. Against most players, I would probably generally just c-bet here, but with info it can tweak me one way or the other. Generally just c-betting, trying to get folds from something like 7s or 3s, that kind of stuff. Plus it's a good to c-bet some bluff hands occasionally against opponents that care. So our logical decision tree would look something like, if we check and he bets, we fold. If we check and he checks, we would just play the turn. If we c-bet and he folds, we win. If we c-bet and he raises, we 3-bet if we think he has enough bluffs, but we normally just fold. If we c-bet and he raises, we fold if we think a 3-bet or a float is useless. If we c-bet and he calls, we hit a queen on the turn. We're double barrel if we think it's good. We check if we don't. If we c-bet and he calls, we hit a brick on the turn. We can double barrel if we think it's good, but probably check through, because most of the time if he calls the flop, he's not folding if a 3 comes on the turn. If we c-bet and he calls and we improve on the turn, we can bet if we think he would bluff raise it or call with worse. We can check if we think he'd bluff it, and we can check if we think that he would just never call with worse if we were to bet if we, say, binked an ace or a king on the turn. So, you see, we pretty much have a plan for every logical happening that could possibly happen. Is it really that important? maybe not. But it's important that when we're doing our off-session analysis and we're thinking about the different lines we can take, that we're thinking about the ramifications of those lines and what would logically happen, and do we want that? Does it happen at a good frequency? Does it happen with a good payoff? Blah, blah, blah. And we could even take this a step further and even think about being on the river. So once we play the flop action out, we really only have two decision matrices left. On the turn, we could check the bet. On the river, we could do the same. And it's really not that complicated. It gets complicated when you make it complicated. If you simply realize that when you're playing post-flop, you have three streets, and at any given time, you generally have no more than three options to check, to fold, to call, to fold, or to raise. It's very, very simple. The decision matrix gets very simple if you make it simple. If you break away from saying, oh shit, there's like 9,000 different turn cards and this and that, and just say, okay, here's my hand, here's my opponent, here's what I'm going to do. Again, make everything simple. Poker's not as complicated as most of you guys make it, especially as you start getting better. You really want to start simplifying this kind of process. Alright, so back to the hand. We decide to c-bet because we think that it's going to show enough profit to be good. And he decides to call. Turn comes an ace, and the action is back on us. So we, of course, have our two options. We can bet it or we can check it. Very simple. So we could bet if we think that our opponent would be stationary with all pairs, if we thought that he would call tens again or call something like 9-10 all the way down. Sure, we could consider betting. Other than that, we can, the other option is to consider checking. And checking is a very valid option against most opponents. The bet probably isn't going to get called by many worse hands, especially against this player type. But a check might induce him to turn something like tens into a bluff, or maybe he had a float range on the flop and we get him to bluff that. Or maybe he doesn't bet anything, but he feels more comfortable on the river with a hand like king jack and he calls a bet. Or maybe he has pocket fives and we minimize loss. All these are good possible happenings that happen by checking and create that mistake-rich environment that we want. So our logical decision tree now would be that if we bet and he folds, we would win. If we bet and he calls, we play the river. If we bet and he raises, does he ever bluff here? If not, probably fold. If enough, then we could consider calling. The other option, of course, is to check. If we check and he checks behind, we bet the riv. If we check and he bets, we call and play the river outs. So very, very simple, not too complex, and this is standard that as we get deeper and deeper in a hand, the decision matrix gets smaller and smaller because there are fewer things that could possibly happen. We only have one street to play left, unlike on the flop where we had two. So we decide to go for the check, and he checks behind, and we get ace-6 on the river. So at this point in the hand, we have two options. Of course, we could check or we can bet. So check. Check gives him the chance to turn a bluff on the riv. But if he didn't take the spot to bluff on the turn, there's not much reason for us to think that he's probably going to be bluffing on the riv. When he checks behind on the turn, he probably has something with some showdown value, so there's not much reason to think that we can induce many bluffs here. So checking to induce that isn't really going to be all that great. The other option, of course, is we can bet, and we would bet probably because he has something like showdown value. We can probably expect to get calls from worse hands at least sometimes, and we're probably never really behind. Really, the only hand that we're behind of is a binked pocket sixes. It's very rare that he would ever check something like pocket nines or pocket fives behind, so there's just not that much reason to think that we're behind here. And this falls right in line with our two-street goal with the top pair hands. As for the size of the bet, we should bet big enough that it gets value and small enough that he feels comfortable. Generally, something like a half-pot bet will do the trick. We don't generally need to be that much bigger than that here, especially because if we bet something like 13 or 14, it might really scare the crap out of him. So at this point, if we looked at our decision tree, if we were to check and he checks behind, we obviously lose a lot of value. If we check and he bets, we can call, but again, we don't expect him to bluff all that much, so it's kind of silly. And if we bet and he folds, we win. If we bet and he calls, we win. If we bet and he raises, we can make a decision. Again, it's pretty unlikely that he'd be bluffing there, but again, if we feel something in the timing or the sizing, we can make a decision, but most of the time, we're just pretty much expecting for him to call and for us to win here. So he ends up calling with queens, and we end up shipping pretty much the biggest possible pot we could against a tag with a top pair type hand. And this is a very standard hand, but with planning it became much easier. Even if we just planned for the street we were on by asking what our different plays accomplished. Again, this skill gets easier in time, but it's important for creating lines in real time and building default lines. The concept of default lines oftentimes anger players, saying that there are no static lines in default games. I agree and disagree. We usually take relatively default lines with big hands, especially against unknowns and fish. That default line being get as much money in as possible as quickly as possible. And while it's important to have dynamic lines against players that can hand read and such, default lines are still relevant, especially in microgames. Default lines are things that we can build off table in our studying time, and we deviate from them as our information dictates. So that's going to wrap up this concept of the week on planning. Hopefully, it gives you some things to think about in your poker exploration. Just remember to think about what your lines accomplish and take lines that create mistake rich environments. This stuff becomes second nature. Just keep working with it and you'll get it. Good luck, guys, and happy grinding.